Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for your patience. Nice to see you all today. We're so glad you could join us. We'll pause just a moment to give everybody a chance to get their audio connected, and then we will get started. It's so nice to see some of you. Oh my gosh. Hi, Katie and Kim. Hello. Hi, Val. Hi, Lydia. Gosh, we didn't know that. We're so excited to have this day happening. We're talking about reviving instructional rounds. We know this is near and dear to all of us on this call today. All right, so we will just go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to meet with us this afternoon. You know, today's purpose is really twofold. One, to get us excited again about the possibility of rounds, provide you a little background, and then share with you our current thinking about what that might look like. So I think I know literally everybody on the call, but my name is Bridget Regan. I'm one of the literacy consultants at RISA, and I'm serving as, I guess, kind of the lead person to get rounds going. And I'm joined by my two lovely co-hosts. Heather, do you want to introduce yourself, and then we can kick it to Jeff?
Sure. I think I know everyone on this call too, but good to see everybody. I'm Heather Ratterman, Assessment and Instruction Consultant.
Hi, I don't know everybody on this call, but I know some of you. My name's Jeff Austin. I'm a new literacy consultant at RISA. I joined the team about 2.5 months ago. Prior to that, I was an English teacher, a department chair, a curriculum coordinator at central office, an instructional coach, a writing center director. So probably like many of you, have worn many hats in the time I've been in education. So it's nice to see all of you. Yeah, this is just echoing Bridget. It's a really exciting day to be able to talk about instructional rounds and think about how this might look again.
All right, so with no further ado, let us begin. We want to make sure that we're grounding this work in our network, right? So while rounds can take, the form of, many content areas, we're going to really try to hone in on our literacy lens as we engage in rounds. We really want to thank you for your willingness to partner or even just think about, maybe doing this again, or maybe starting this for the first time. We know we had kind of an abrupt pause, if you will, on rounds just about exactly 2 years ago. So here's where we're going to go this afternoon. We have set aside about 90 minutes today for us to work together. We're not sure if we'll need all that time. It might depend on, the questions that come in. So I would like to invite you to populate questions in the chat as things come up along the way. We're a small group, so we'll probably invite you perhaps in the moment to share your question. And then we can also save some questions for the end. But our agenda is as follows. We're going to take a quick kind of brief recap of what our instructional rounds, just to ground us. And I promise it'll be quick. And then why rounds, right? We're going to step into the why for a few minutes. And then how are we proposing for instructional rounds to be revived or rebooted? And then we'll talk about next steps, which includes an interest survey. Okay, so stepping into the what are rounds, just take a moment in this graphic, and I'm going to remind us that rounds are not the way that, we at RISA are defining rounds, not a program, not an event, not an evaluation, not used to monitor something you're trying to implement, and they're not passive. I'm going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to read and reflect on what rounds are in that right-hand column. As you view that list on the right and you think about your own context and your setting that you're in right now, I'd like you to drop in the chat for us, if you will, which one of those most excites you on the right as you think about your current setting. You can go ahead and just put the first few words or just, sum it up. Which one excites you the most as you think about your current setting? I'm seeing these coming in. This idea of collective learning really seems to be that common thread, right? I would agree. Rounds are a beautiful way for that to happen, right? We know that the answer is in the room. If you did rounds with us in the past, you'll recall us saying that. The things that you see on the right are all valued processes, right? Maybe you've engaged in peer-to-peer observations with your teachers, or critical friends groups, or walkthroughs, PLCs, or teacher principal study groups. While these are all valued practices, they are not what we are defining as instructional rounds. Now, sometimes these things come out as a result of an action step through the rounds process. But again, we just want to be careful that we're grounding ourselves and defining ourselves in the same way. We also know that in rounds, we're really observing the practice, right? So what is it that we see? You know, as we observe, we want to make sure that we keep our observations grounded in what we're actually seeing, not what we think we're seeing, what we hope to see, but what we're actually seeing. And we're also being mindful to not make it about individual teachers, right? It's really focused on the collective. And we know from our work when we worked with Dr. Elmore that if we want to increase student learning, there's only there's really three ways that you can do it. You have to improve the level of the content, increase the teacher's knowledge and skill, or improve student engagement, right? And we know that we define these things as, through Dr. Elmore's work, as the instructional core, and the strong relationship between those three things. So as we get ready to reboot rounds again this fall, we're going to hone in on the importance of the core as well, as you can see on this slide. And at the heart of what is at the instructional core, of course, is the task, right? We know that if we're paying close attention and coming in and observing our students as we engage in rounds, and we're really looking to see what is there, again, not what we hope to see, zooming in on the task is one way to help us do that, because we know that the task that is given to students will predict their performance. Another key piece around the instructional core is the idea of the problem of practice, right? And so if it's not in the instructional core, we're not going to be focusing on it during a given rounds visit. Additionally, you know, it's really imperative that we record our observations as pieces of data and not attach judgments to that. So if you engage in rounds and as we get going, it's important that each school collectively will determine what it is that they want to study, right? This is the power of rounds. We're not coming in with a checklist ahead of time of what we think we should see, but rather what is it as a staff that you may be struggling in. Perhaps it's in lifting student voice or student discourse. And so then that can become the focus. So this will be a big part of our learning as we reboot again, zooming in on that problem of practice. Being mindful, of course, I'm going to turn this to Jeff, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the ladder of inference, right? As we think about that problem of practice. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. If you, I'm sure many of you are aware, but in case you're not, Learning Forward has just put out revised professional learning standards. And in those professional learning standards, actually a lot of overdue attention was paid to issues of equity. And as professionals, we know that we need to develop our equity literacy while understanding how that influences us at philosophical, habitual, and relational levels. So part of equity literacy is making the unconscious visible so that we can interrogate it. And the Learning Forward standards make this very clear. Rounds can be a space, I think, to develop greater equity literacy, but we have to be really intentional about it. The ladder of inference is a visual representation of a thinking process that we move through, usually unconsciously, to get from an idea to action. And the key word there, I think, is unconsciously. If we're not actively thinking about our biases and our predispositions, we can move to action without taking time to consider all the things that might be informing that action. And unfortunately, this usually means that we're simply replicating what already exists rather than making the changes that we need to make. So while rounds can and should affirm what we know and what we can do and what we see happening in classroom spaces, we also have to be careful that we're intentionally disrupting how and what we think to avoid confirmation bias. The issues in literacy education are really complex. And so we have to be prepared to hold that complexity and its associated internal conflict rather than just jumping straight to action. So rooting instructional rounds in equity requires us to look at and do something about the perspectives and practices and biases that accelerate us to the top of the ladder. So I guess in other words, rounds is really about slowing us down to speed us up. Um, and that leads us to the next slide, which is really about interrogating those biases. We know that as educators and leaders that we need a more robust understanding of both the cognitive and socio-political factors that are related to the development of print-based reading skills. So when we don't attend to both the cognitive and the socio-political factors together, that's when we can perpetuate inequity and harm. So rounds can be one of the tools that we use to disrupt current and prevent future inequities. But we individually and collectively have to be bias aware and equity centered and asset based in our mindsets as we enter this process. Rounds should move us away from deficit orientation and savior mindsets. Rounds, as Bridget said earlier, are not about fixing students or teachers, but they are about looking at our contexts, our learning environments, our instructional practices, our personal and institutional biases, and the cognitive and socio-political elements that are at play to develop new perspectives and new practices that will serve students, especially those who are most marginalized. So I guess to sum that up, rounds aren't about fixing people, but they should be about fixing injustice and attaching unconditional positive regard to everybody in our organizations. So students have complex needs, but if rounds are successful, we're going to come away with a new vision that allows every student to find success as their fullest selves in a hospitable environment. I'm going to talk about a readiness tool a little bit later on in this webinar. And we've added some of the equity dimensions in accordance with the Learning Forward standards. We believe strongly that some basis in equity literacy and some understanding how equity impacts all other dimensions of the work is really important to making rounds a really equity-based practice. I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who's going to talk about some data and assessment work that happens with rounds. Heather?
Thanks, Jeff. And that was beautiful as you were speaking about bias, because part of engaging in rounds is really checking those biases when we walk into classrooms and we're centering our observations around a problem of practice. So during the rounds process, teams will come together and they will go in and out of different classrooms looking for things within the instructional core, remember student, content, teacher, or the task, as it relates to the problem of practice. So whatever problem of practice a school selects must be visible in that instructional core so that observers can go in and look for these things. As observers are inside the classroom, they're really only looking for what they actually see as it relates to the instructional core, not what they want to see, what they hope to see, or what they think they're seeing. They jot their information down onto we used clipboards in the past with a note catcher. And then at the end of the observation process, we get together back in our space, our classroom generally, and we transfer our notes onto sticky notes. And this process really is helpful in a variety of ways, but the most important piece of that is that you're working to take whatever notes that you took to make them really objective on the sticky note. So this is an opportunity to rid the implicit bias that you might be bringing into that classroom. We all have them as we have different lenses and different experiences. So this opportunity of moving your notes to sticky notes is really, we're using objective language. And then after we've moved the notes onto sticky notes, we work as a team, as a table team, and we read off our sticky notes of our observations. And this is another opportunity where we can check, the group can check each other for those judgy statements or subjective statements that may have slipped into onto the sticky note. Once that's done and the group agrees, we then put the sticky notes onto a chart paper where we look for themes. So if I had a sticky note that was a similar theme as Jeff or Bridget, we would cluster them together and then we would give it a name. So in the past, we've seen things like technology as a theme, or vocabulary as a theme. Once that's complete, go ahead to the next slide. Once that's completed, the group then presents the findings to the school. And then it's really up to the school to determine what they want to do based on the observations that were done and the findings or themes that came through. And so then now it's really the school's opportunity to take part of that collective learning process and decide where they want to go next. Some of the things that we found when we engaged in rounds a few years ago were that partnerships were built across school districts. And we even found out that professional development was shared across the school district because of the rounds process and looking to learn around similar things or similar content. We also found that networking continued even after the process ended, and that districts found that they needed to really go slow to go fast with their learning. In fact, some of the things that we've heard from those districts that have engaged in rounds is that some of this work is still continuing, maybe more at a school level, or due to COVID and having restrictions of visitors that could come, they've kind of taken it and morphed it into their own school-based rounds. Our mantra when we come into the school as a rounds team and as a network is that no teacher will be harmed. And we work really hard with the host site and with the host site staff to make sure that you're really ready to have different people coming into the classroom really centered on looking at that observation through the lens of a problem of practice and not a teacher evaluation. So we work really hard with the staff to ready the staff and the building to make sure that everybody is ready, and we don't see dog and pony shows, but we actually see real raw teaching taking place.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I know we kind of joked about it in the past, but I really think this might be the year where we get those printed on t-shirts, right? With the rounds team, right? We'd like to have that, our little mantra on t-shirts. So now we're going to shift in our agenda to the why. Why for rounds? I think we've already lifted some of the why as you listened, but just to remind everyone about our Wayne County Literacy Theory of Action, and that instructional rounds is one of the specific action items on this theory of action. As you recall, this theory of action was developed in partnership with all of you, meaning all of your districts. Several years ago, we had a district team, or we had a county-wide team that represented superintendents and some curriculum directors and some folks from RISA that came together to deeply study change theory and taking action in literacy. And the result was this beautiful theory of action. So the work we've done in rounds, is really helping us make this come to life. We're actually getting to see it now firsthand. One of the things in education, that we have to be mindful of is this need. We have this temptation to look for a quick solution to things, right? This solutionitis, where we're constantly jumping to implement solutions before it's really clear. So rounds can really help address that, right? Can really help get to the root of what is happening in classrooms before we look to find, the next program or the next thing that we need to, that we think we might need to do. It really creates a different mindset and a new way of thinking. So another reason for the why. I'm going to turn it to Jeff, who's going to share a few more reasons.
Yeah, I mean, the exciting part about this word cloud that you're seeing on the screen right now is that this came from the initial folks that were involved in rounds a couple of years back. So this is actually lifted from them. And it really highlights what you all had said earlier in the chat about um, that you were excited about collective learning and communities of practice. And I think that's what rounds can bring us. So it's no surprise that collaboration is really at the heart of this word cloud. I was in charge of a school-based instructional rounds process at the high school level in my former district. And I will say it was a catalyst for building a more collaborative culture than existed before. Um, I will also say that the best collaborations have shared vulnerability at the center of them, and rounds really requires a kind of level of trust and openness to be truly successful. And that means getting each participant and each team into and safely out of the process. And we're really serious, as Bridget was saying, with the shirts and we're really serious and intentional about ensuring that everybody has that kind of experience as much as we can. To this end, it's helpful to remember that rounds is about addressing a shared need across systems to develop new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new perspectives. Again, it's not about fixing broken people. Rounds are about leveraging the power of the collective wisdom to make the big complex work ahead of us a little bit lighter. And as Bridget said earlier, rounds are not passive, so we're all engaged in that work together. And this is why we say that rounds is not an event, but instead it's about building a network. I think given the complexity and importance of, as I was saying earlier, the sociopolitical and cognitive elements of literacy teaching, having a really durable, trusting community of practice is vital to our continued journey forward of having transformational literacy classrooms and literacy practices. So when we're engaged in the network of shared learning and shared needs and shared purpose, I think we can really start imagining together with one another a different and brighter future with our students. So the good news is by investing in rounds, you're also investing in a long-term professional learning network and the enduring relationships and boundless imagination that comes from that collective wisdom and community of practice. So I'm going to turn it to Bridget, who's going to talk a little bit more about the developments of rounds here in Wayne County.
So we're going to take a little stroll down memory lane here for just a quick moment, again, to keep grounding ourselves in the how. And I know that some of the folks on the call, you actually lived this, right? You were in, you engaged in these rounds, and others you were coming alongside and checking it out to see, ooh, is this something I may want to do for our district and our setting. So we started as we think about, we'll first take a peek at this slide, right? We know that we can learn from data, right, along this change continuum. And we know that there are multiple steps to take along the way. But when we first launched rounds, we started with that yellow box, right? How might we think about developing a change on a small scale? We were really intentional. Although the interest back in 2018 and the fall of 2018 was immense across the county, we specifically created a cohort model so that we could kind of, as Jeff said earlier, go slow to go fast, right? Because we knew we wanted to develop change, but by starting on the smaller scale, we knew that based on, this change theory, that we'd be more likely to be successful. So here was how we started. As you look in the top left corner of this graphic, we started with districts that we had what we referred to as cohort A, network A, in 2018-19, and we jumped in with them kind of full force, right? They were divided into two cohorts within that group based on their implementation readiness, and we jumped right in. Groups B and C came along for the ride, but at a slightly slower pace. So they were, Network B was invested in and came along and participated in some of the rounds visits with Network A that first school year. Then fast forward to 1920, we had a group of 6 districts in Network B, And of course, we all recall in the spring of 2020 what happened, right? Things kind of were put on pause due to the pandemic. So that's where we kind of left off, and Network C had just started some things with Network B. So as we think about moving forward, then, oh, here's another visual, just to kind of give you another visual of who was involved back there in the beginning. And we've already mentioned the great and late, sadly, Dr. Elmore, who really helped kick our work off. If you have not heard, he passed away just a little over a year ago, but we know that his legacy is going to carry on in our network. We were so fortunate to have him come and kick off our network, and his work was really based out of Harvard, and the work that he and his colleagues did to develop this model. So that is the model. While we know there are other great models of rounds, the model that we're adhering to is really the model from Harvard that was really inspired from his work in the medical rounds initiative. So Jeff's going to say a bit more about what we learned here.
Yeah, I mean, as we've been talking about, collaboration, shared learning, this all requires, again, a really deep sense of relational trust and a willingness to be open and vulnerable. So when rounds first started a few years ago, as Bridget shared, the partner schools were surveyed about their hopes and fears, which allowed some generative discussion about the process and the outcome. As you can see, the hopes really centered around the potential for instructional growth, and you might expect that, I would. But I also thought it was interesting that words like intentionality and collaboration were lifted, as they've been common themes throughout today's presentation. Building intentional, durable, meaningful communities of practice, I think, is really the power of this of a rounds practice. The fears also, maybe not surprisingly, focused on issues of scarce time, of shiny object syndrome, issues of trust. These are important things to work through too. Teachers and leaders have less time than ever because they're being asked to do more than ever to meet the needs of students. So it's also really important here again to establish a really clear rationale for doing this, a level of trust to make sure that there's that level of openness and vulnerability that's required. And just going back to what we were saying earlier, this is another reason why rounds are not an event, they're a network. That's really critical. And I also want to say that maybe you even have similar hopes and fears as you've heard about this today or you came to this webinar. So how do you know if you and your district and your teachers are ready to take the next step into rounds, or what your entry point might be? So luckily, we've developed a readiness tool that you can use as self-assessment, really, to determine what your personal and district readiness is for rounds. There's
Jeff,
entry.
I was going to say, I can stop sharing if you want to share your
Sure.
screen to pull this up.
I sure can.
As Jeff is pulling this up, if you were in the network before, you may recall that we had a readiness tool. This one is the new and improved version that he's going to walk you through, so you can get a sense of that. And thank you, Heather, for dropping it in the chat.
So this is our new readiness tool. We hope you think it's improved too. We do. Really, as you're going to see as you scroll through this, you're going to see really considerations in 4 domains: collective efficacy, literacy, school improvement and development, and professional learning. Each domain contains equity components that we believe, and Learning Forward believes, are important to your preparation to be involved in the rounds project, including ensuring teachers are being trained in asset-based and community-centered instructional approaches, open and active discussions about bias and inequity and injustice, an awareness of trauma-informed teaching practices that allow each student to be met with unconditional positive regard, and some other things that we've put in here as well. We know that these are the conditions for success for all students, but especially those who are underserved. And we want to ensure that we're taking the time to meet the needs of those students through this process. So you can see here under collective efficacy that teachers hold students in unconditional positive regard, and that there's a normalized culture of high expectations for each student, rooted in a belief that they can learn and want to learn. So that mindset's pretty critical. If you're not there yet with your staff, that's okay. As we always like to say, start where you are, but don't stay there. And quite frankly, having a rounds process may actually accelerate some of your equity efforts, right? We can learn things from each other, and really think about how we're bringing instructional equity back to our districts and our spaces. Even though the context might not be the same, we can take what we learn and apply it to our own contexts, and that's what's cool. So I'm going to turn it back over to Heather now, and she is going to explain really how to get involved with rounds, and like I said, all of the different entry points that are possible. So the reimagined how, featuring Heather.
So we've come up with 3 different options or entry points for districts to engage in the rounds process. So we're kind of moving away from the idea of cohorts. So option 1 is you could be in a space that you've engaged in rounds in the past and you're ready to begin this fall. And so we've included some of those action steps that you might take. So you might go through your readiness tool again, identify a host school and assemble your core rounds team that's going to help facilitate maybe some learning with the staff at the host school, identifying that problem of practice. I'm going through like a refresher. We're gonna design a refresher for all of the schools that are in option 1, and then be ready to host a rounds day in maybe fall or early winter, and then participate on a rounds visit to another host site that year. You may be feeling maybe option 2 was a better entry point for you, where you are looking to begin the rounds process in the winter or spring of next school year. And so you can participate in a rounds visit with the option 1 schools and complete all of the action items 1 through 4 from option 1. And then maybe even working at a little bit of a slower pace to ready your staff and really dig deep to discover a problem of practice, and then get ready to host a visit around February through May. You may be entering into this work at option 3, where you are thinking maybe not this school year, but maybe next school year, but that you're still interested in providing some learning for your staff because this is where you know you want to go. You may be able to participate in be a visitor on a rounds visit just to see how it happens, so that you can then share your experience with your district or your schools or staff to further ready the work. You may also want to engage in that readiness tool just to see where you are, and then know where you may want to begin some of that work based on that readiness tool. So these are the 3 options that we've outlined, and we're hoping that one of them best fits your needs. And of course, we will work to customize support as your rounds team. We will work to customize support for you depending on which option you select. As something that we are going to do, we started it the last time we started rounds prior to the pandemic, but I don't know if we just got so excited we forgot to administer a post survey, but we are going to be a little bit more intentional about collecting some information, some evidence of impact from the host site. So if you engage in the rounds, participants will be asked to complete a pre and a post survey. And the survey questions are really, it's all around perception as it relates to instruction, assessment, school improvement practices, classroom observations, collective efficacy, and then decision making at the school level. So that will be something that anybody engaging in rounds, hosting rounds will do. It will be a quick pre-post, very easy to do, won't take long. And so if you are interested, and we hope that you are, we have an interest survey that we will drop into the chat, or you can use your phone and scan the QR code. We are hoping to have an idea of who's interested, the districts that are interested, so that we can begin making some decisions around pairing schools up, and then knowing who will need more support throughout next school year, and who may be joining through option 3 and maybe wanting to just participate in a visit. So this will be due by June 30th.
All right, and believe it or not, that brings us to our question area. So what questions might you have? We're going to invite you to ask questions. I'm also going to put this slide up for just a moment in case you want to snap a picture of our contact information. And in just a moment, I'll stop sharing screen so that we can all see each other and keep this part of the webinar a bit more informal. We did record this session, so if you have other district leaders or folks back in your district, maybe not, just teachers, right, in your teacher leaders that you'd like to listen and kind of remember what rounds was all about, if you were engaged in this in the past, or if you're new to this whole idea and you want to introduce someone, we'll make sure this recording is available for you. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see one another, and just invite you to either raise your hand using the raise the hand feature in Zoom, and or just come off mute or drop a question in the chat. What are you wondering about? How can we help?
I'll start. So we were happy enough to be involved in rounds, Audrey Kalis from Groseal, last time around, and we were in cohort 2. So just about to host a visit. We had been on visits, just about to host a visit when we shut down. So we have one school that's very ready to pick right back up, but others that we would like to get involved that aren't at the same spot. Is this an opportunity for just one building per district, or would we be able to have different buildings in at multiple levels?
We say the more the merrier.
All right.
Right. So if there's ways that we can, and then we can draw upon the expertise of the building that's more ready, right, to kind of get started. So we can kind of build that as we go. So please go ahead and, find a way to complete that interest form as best as you can to articulate that. I think we left a spot in the form at the end for you to just say, what you were thinking. So please go ahead and include that.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I see Lydia, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, hon. What are you wondering?
Thank you. So I was wondering 2 things. First, if we were a school that was in the option 3, what would it look like the first year? Like what kinds of learning would our staff experience?
So some of that is yet to be developed, but our initial thinking is that we would perhaps engage in a book study. Perhaps we could come to, if there was a host school that was interested, we could come and do a mini learning session, a mini shared learning through, reading an article just for them to gauge what rounds is about. Perhaps some short video clips that kind of give folks the idea of what rounds is, very similar to what we did at the beginning of this webinar, where we kind of walked through what are rounds and what they're not, to give folks a sense of that. So it'd be an opportunity to start kind of whetting people's appetite, if you will, and getting them excited about perhaps the possibility. And then kind of going from there. And then depending on how much interest we get, in our option 1 group and or option 2, we might be able to invite some folks from your district to come and participate in rounds, because we found from past experience, when folks get a chance to do it and live it, they see it completely differently, right? Sometimes they have a preconceived idea of what rounds is, but then
Mhm.
when they actually live it and experience it, they feel differently. Jeff or Heather, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, we've even had schools that were in that first cohort that we had to do a little bit more readiness work
Mhm.
to prepare the staff because of what they had imagined rounds being. They really felt it was evaluative, that we were coming in to
Mhm.
judge their teaching, judge their practices. And so a lot of the work that we do with the network and even with staff on these host visits is that we really work to show that we're not, it's not about evaluation. We're not judging. These are the things that we're actually going to look for. So we could do like a mock problem of practice. We could
Mhm.
do video clips, and that we're really just looking to see what's happening. We also have some agreements before we go into any classroom or any school that we are not to assume anything beyond what we're actually seeing. So we really
Mhm.
work to not jump to those, go higher on that ladder of inference, but that
Mhm.
we assume good intent on the part of educator and students, and that we recognize that they have built relationships and things happen. Like we were on a rounds visit and a kid like threw up. I mean, things happen. It's right. It's school. We're dealing with little human beings, but that we're really focusing in on that problem of practice. And because we're so focused in on that, that's all we're looking for. So we've also, Lydia, developed some modules. They're not recorded. They're slide decks that kind of go like almost like baby steps. So if a school even wanted to like do some of this work during like a staff meeting, we have some resources and facilitation guides that we can even support the school with too.
And one thing I'll just throw out there to echo and build on Bridget and Heather, I really see option 3 as a really good opportunity to do some like ecology building, right? Like I think about like schools and districts as little environments,
Mhm.
and so setting up that ecology that Heather was talking about, I think is really important. So as I mentioned, when I was doing this work at the 9-12 level, really building up cultures of collaboration and really thinking through like what does it mean to get ready to have other people in your classroom, and how do we make sure that that's a safe experience
Mhm.
for everybody. So that's where I really see option 3, and a lot of the book studies and the site visits and the modules. I think those all can help develop that environment that's like, okay,
Mhm.
we're ready to do this. But if those, I would argue that those foundational pieces are really important to the long-term success and sustainability
Mhm.
of rounds. So I that's how I kind of see option 3 playing out in my mind. So I just want to throw that out there.
I do have one more question that is related to that. Is there, and I'm sure a lot of schools experience this, we have an ongoing need to improve our tier 1 instruction in order to be successful in tier 2 and 3 with our students. So do you need to be at some starting point to be interested in the instructional round process, or not? Does that make sense? Like, should we be somewhere? Should we have a strong tier 1 before we think about entering into instructional rounds? Or that's part of the goal to improve that tier?
I think it can be part of the goal. Certainly, that's where the readiness tool is going to help you, right?
Mhm.
And
Okay.
so I think when you take a look at that readiness tool, and that's something,
Mhm.
Lydia, you and I can sit together, since I'm pretty familiar with your context and setting, and really
Okay.
determine if this is,
If it's
which
good.
entry point would be, right? I think there's
Mhm.
entry points in rounds for all systems. The readiness part really comes in terms of, a huge part of it is the willingness of the teachers, right?
Right.
And as Jeff said, creating that culture
Mhm.
of we're gonna come in and visit each other. And so there are sometimes some ways we can take baby steps to making that happen. But I don't think there necessarily has to be you have to be at a certain level in your tier 1 implementation to be able to have rounds. In fact, sometimes the opposite, right? Like I've participated in rounds where they were really looking to strengthen, this was on the other side of the state, strengthen their tier 1 because they knew they were having some challenges, right? And so that became part of their problem of practice and their focus.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. What other questions? Other questions, folks?
I have one, Bridget.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead.
We were in cohort A, the first round. Since then, we've had, I have a lot of new teachers. So a good large chunk of them did not have that initial training that you came and did with us. They did not participate in the rounds when they were here, and they haven't ever participated in them. So one of my questions is, would cohort 2, right? Was it numbered this time? Or option 2 be a place where we could start, or do you think we need to wait and do option 3 so that there's time to do all those things, front load everything and do all of those things before we jump into it again?
I think we could possibly start. That's a great question. I'd have to think a little bit more about that. Perhaps really could be option 1 or 2, I think could work.
Okay.
I think it comes down to that readiness tool, right? So we can take a look at that tool, and you could really think about the majority of your staff, maybe have an informal conversation with them to kind of gauge, right? It's really about having that culture. Even though you have a lot of new staff members, are they used to having other people coming in and out, right? And if not, maybe do they need a little time to get used to that idea? And then if that's the case, then, maybe it's option 2. But really, when you look at option 1 and 2, they're very, very similar, right? We know that we have some schools that might be ready, boom, to have their visits scheduled right away in the fall. We come and do a refresher in August or September, and off we go. And we could do that.
I don't know if we're there. Like I was looking at between option 2 and option 3. My initial gut said option 2. But then when I was looking at the readiness tool, I think from my lens, the most important piece from that readiness tool would be the collective efficacy piece. Like, do we have the culture for it? Because in looking at the other parts of it, like honestly, the school improvement and development part, so many things have happened since COVID that like that one slide that said like solutionize or whatever it was, like everything from the transition from to my KIP and everything else from at my perspective as a building leader, like what's school improvement? What's my plan that I fall back on, which has always been our anchor. And I don't feel like that anchor is necessarily there right now. So I have some work to do with my team to say, what is that anchor and where do we capture that in a plan? Because we don't necessarily, my KIP isn't solidified yet, right? So we don't even know 100% how we go back and look at that and what are our accountability tools for that and all the other stuff. So that was some of the work that we were going to do for the rest of this year and then over the summer and then getting started next year was how do we get this stuff somewhere so that when we say, but wait, we said we were going to do this and hold ourselves accountable to this, how do we fall back? What do we fall back on? So without that school improvement plan written like it used to be, it's a little bit harder. And I think COVID kind of blew that up a little bit too. So, all these other things were happening with COVID and we were, having our small cohort model and all this other stuff. And it just kind of really, everything imploded. So we have some work to do to get back to those things. And so then again, I was like, does that mean option 3 would be a better idea for us because we have some other work to do in the meantime?
So here's what I'm just going to suggest. I think what you could do is check option 2, and then we can start the work and engage in it. And as we're going, we'll be able to gauge better as we're living it and in the moment where your folks are at. Right. And if we're starting to feel partway through or you're starting to sense, oh, okay, maybe we're not really ready for a visit in the spring, late winter or spring, but maybe the next year, then so be it. Then we just shift, right? We're willing to make those adjustments because I think what you lifted, Katie, it's so powerful what you shared, right? I think things imploded for everyone, right? Not just you. I think that's probably true of everybody on this call, right? Like school improvement plan, like, let's be real. We were in solutionitis. The whole world was in solutionitis for the last 2 years, right? So now it's a mindset shift for all of us as well, right? As
Well,
the
and our data was
leaders.
all over the place.
Of
too. I mean,
course.
we had kids who were in person, we had kids who were virtual, who were getting probably some help, like data's all over the place. Some kids took M-Step, some kids didn't. So it's like, what are we using to even as a measurement tool to decide where do we go next?
Totally makes sense. And that's where, again, I think rounds could be a vehicle to help you do that, right? That could be the problem of practice, right? What do we see? How is it? And it could help drive what some of those action steps could be.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're toggling between 2 and 3, don't get too hung up on that. Go with your gut. We can, get the ball rolling. We can start working together and then we can go from there.
Okay.
Right. I mean, if anything, our intent with this model was to be flexible, right? We didn't want to limit it to just those districts that were involved before. We're opening this to everyone, across the county. And we didn't want folks to feel like they had to be at a certain place, right? Because you might not know what that place is until we actually get into the work. And that's okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Also, I just want to throw out there, Katie, too, that I don't think, as you go through that readiness tool, I don't think any school is going to be able to check that they're fully ready on every domain and every focus area. That would be totally impossible, especially given what we've been through. I think the other piece, we talked about option 3 as being like really an ecology building piece and really building that environment, getting that culture going. I think if you feel like you have a good culture, but you maybe just need some, now you're starting to build some frameworks because the ground is firm, right? You're not building on sand necessarily. You have some firm ground to build some structures on. That's where I think option 2 can be really helpful, is to say like, okay, like we've got solid ground. So now let's build some frameworks and structures that can really help us and move us forward. So, I was talking to somebody about this on Friday. It's, everybody, this is part of solutionitis. We all want to accelerate, but we can't accelerate until we acknowledge the current reality of the situation. So, I think option 2 is just a really good place to say like, hey, I'm acknowledging my very current reality of a lot of turnover, a lot of new staff, a lot of shifting. And in order to accelerate, we're going to slow down, we're going to build some frameworks and then move forward. So I think option 2 might be a good spot.
Okay, thanks.
What other questions might you have? Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for jumping on this call with us today. Again, as we mentioned earlier, we did record this. We will put that out for everyone. We're also hosting another webinar tomorrow. If there's others in your district that weren't able to join today, we're going to pretty much go through the same thing we did just now. So you can invite others if you have teacher leaders back in your settings. I know in many cases your instructional or literacy coaches were a big part of the team. So if they happen to have some time tomorrow and could jump on the call at 9, even if they couldn't stay for the whole thing, we're happy to have them. So please keep that in mind. And I know you have our contact information. I can put that back up on the screen one more time for everyone. Please reach out. Oh, Val, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about something, and I don't know if this is the appropriate place. So just being to this whole thing, just tell me that's for another day or whatever. But I'm just wondering. I don't know if it could be like considered for like an option 4 or whatever. But I know one of the barriers that we talked about with instructional rounds is the sub shortage and all of that. And one of my, it's particular to me, passion of mine is to develop principals. And I think, we talk a lot about the teacher shortage and all that, but there's a significant administrator shortage, and it's only going to get worse if we don't invest in our principals. And I'm just wondering if this is a place where we can start to have a conversation about using instructional rounds to develop and support our principals through growth, whether they're new principals or seasoned principals, or if that is maybe a different group within RISA that I can talk to or whatever. we've kind of taken a different approach to instructional rounds at Groziel, based on this level of thinking that I have. And Audrey, I don't know if you want to pipe in at all about, you know, what, because I know you know what I'm talking about here, but we are doing instructional rounds only with our principals. We're not using a problem of practice. We're more so trying to use the format of it, but change it a little bit and have a focus on almost calibrating observations and best practices that we see in the classroom. And then we're using those in that instructional round to have conversations between myself, our curriculum director, and the principals, because, you know, one principal may see one thing in a classroom and another principal sees something else in a classroom. And, you know, from my leadership perspective, that discrepancy, you know, it's not great for, you know, organizational systems and structures and instructional leadership and whatnot. And it more so just comes from the fact that I just don't think that we spend the time and effort that we should in investing in our building leaders. So I guess I'm just wondering, I'm sorry, this is a really long wondering to get to my question, I apologize. But is this an avenue through the LLN and through relaunching instructional rounds that maybe down the road, I'm not talking about anything next year, but maybe even the year after, where there can almost be this cohort where right now I'm only doing it within Groziel with my Groziel principals, but I would love them to have the same experience that they've had this year with other principals from other districts. And we can almost use our classrooms like lab classrooms. And, you know, where we go into these lab classrooms in different districts and then have the type of discourse that makes instructional rounds so valuable to, you know, instructional leadership. Sorry.
Well, no, it's a great question. And my quick immediate answer is yes, yes, yes. I love this idea. As you lifted, its purpose is a little bit different. Having been a principal myself for almost 10 years, right? So I sat in that seat for quite a while, and there would be great value in that, especially when we're talking about calibrating and, you know, with the high stakes things with teacher evaluation. One principal could go in and observe and see one thing, somebody else sees something completely different. So this rounds could be an opportunity to do that. I completely agree. In fact, when I was able to spend a little time with Dr. Elmore, when we had him with us at RISA several years ago, he shared with me a little bit about some of the early models and different models of instructional rounds up in the East Coast. One of which I'm not sure if it's still going or not, but was a group of superintendents across multiple districts that engaged in instructional rounds as a superintendent cohort, you know, and their purpose again was a little bit different, but they used a very similar model. So certainly we could do some, you know, some research and some inquiry with folks at Harvard and, you know, perhaps others if we learn of others that have done that model. And it's something that we could certainly explore. I think I know that Heather and Jeff would agree that we do want to tap into our principals as well. We feel like that's sometimes an untapped resource. Now, certainly, I know we've got some principals on the call right now. Katie is one of those building leaders, right? And we certainly have principals being a part of this this round, but the purpose is, you know, is a little bit different. So Heather or Jeff, anything to add to that, or anyone else on the call, thoughts around that?
So, you know, with assessment, like observation is part of like gathering data. And it's one of the tools that we use so often, like as a principal or even as in a curriculum director role or superintendent role, we're constantly looking and listening at, you know, for things, but, you know, how do we hone in and use those skills against like a criteria? So like, I'm thinking about like the one that I'm really familiar with is like the Danielson rubric, right? And how are we consistent, you know, with what we look for and what we actually see versus I really like you as a teacher, we get along really well, this is what I thought I saw type of thing. So I would be all for something like this. I think especially for principals that maybe are in smaller districts where there may not be a curriculum director to lean in on, or maybe the super is doing several different roles, that this might be another way to build their expertise with practice, with not necessarily always evaluation, but just with their practice and how they can hone in on their skills as the instructional lead for their building.
We ground our rounds in an instructional framework. So I think, you know, we could do that. We talked about using like an evaluation rubric, but then felt like that was going to send the wrong message to our teachers that it was evaluative. So we really ground the conversations in picking a practice from the instructional framework and then having those conversations around that. And I mean, truly, like, you know, it's probably, you know, a lot of selfishness on my part, but it's how I continue to learn and grow, is through, you know, learning from my principals too, and not wanting to lose sight of that as I sit in this very different chair. So I don't know, Katie, do you see value or worth in what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I was trying to kind of combine that with like inter-rater reliability. So you touched on a good point about not using the evaluation tool afterwards. Even like, I even thought if teachers had no idea that was part of what you were doing, it would still feel evaluative in some way. So something that I thought of when you said that though was, do you have teachers in your district that would let you film them? And then everybody, what evaluation tool do you use?
Well, we are using Thoughtful Classroom, but I'm moving us to 5D.
Okay, so 5D is what we used, and we spent a number of years too doing like K-12 inter-rater reliability, where we would look at scripted evidence from different levels. So we would look at scripted evidence from elementary with a group of K-12 administrators, because what we noticed was that there were more secondary teachers that were being rated highly effective than elementary teachers. And, you know, you could argue a myriad of reasons for that, right? But then we looked at it like, okay, here's the scripted evidence, here's how it was coded, and then talked about why did some people code it one way and some people coded another. But it would have been even more effective, I think, if we had been able to all watch the same 20 minute video clip and then script what we scripted and then code it and then compare it. It was harder to look at the already coded evidence to script it because you're not in there in that moment.
Right. And inter-rater reliability, I think, you know, I did exactly that with 5D in my previous district. I really love that tool. And we did do like that. Guess what I'm talking about is taking it one step like away from the evaluation side of things and really approaching this like a growth and learning opportunity that where we're just having conversations about great instruction and what good instruction looks like and learning from one another. Like I even talked about at the LLN, I know you weren't there, but one of the things I brought up was, you know, being a math trained principal myself, like a math trained teacher, like learning how to be a literacy leader and building my literacy skills. The only opportunity I had to do that was to find my assistant, you know, to hire an assistant principal that was very skilled in literacy. Had I not been in a district big enough or had that opportunity to hire someone, you know, I would have really struggled in that way. So I'm just thinking about like, how do we continue to invest and build in the learning side of things? Plus, I think we should always be, we should lead by example too, right? And we want people, you know, our teachers to have growth mindsets. We want them to be lifelong learners. We want to demonstrate this. We should be, you know, we've been really intentional about talking to our teachers that our instructional rounds are not about you. They're about us.
Mm-hmm.
And they're about us learning from one another and growing from one another and being lifelong learners and walking the talk. But while I'm excited about the work that we're doing in Grosse-Ile right now and believe there's benefit, and I know Audrey feels the same way because her and I have talked a lot about it, we will max out our capacity in this district with the people. We will empty people's toolboxes in terms of the conversation. So I'm hoping to start talking about a way to now then like have a couple of my members go over to Gibraltar, or have them come to Novi, or have Novi come here. And we, you know, we start to go beyond the walls of our own administrative team and learn and grow from talents that, you know, reside in other districts like South and whatnot. So just thinking long-term, and wanted to throw that out there, Bridget, as a possible opportunity. And then also throw out Grozeal, who by next year, you know, will be 2 years into this process and could also maybe even, you know, host, you know, yourself or somebody else just to come see. And I'm not saying what we do is great. I'm sure that, you know, somebody can give us some feedback and help us tweak our process. I literally made it up based on, you know, what I know about instructional rounds, and then trying to model it towards investing in building leadership. But anyways.
The only other thing I would say is when you said earlier, the option 4, like it might be nice for principals to experience it first.
Yeah.
I mean, there's value in experiencing it at the same time, but there's also value in principals experiencing it first somewhere else, so that when you're having conversations about it and how no teacher has ever been harmed in the process, which no teacher was ever harmed here. They may have thought so, but they were not. Like understanding the whole process from start to finish might be helpful.
That's a good point too.
In real life too.
Yeah,
Because we did it with Dr. Elmore. We did it at that training, but it was watching videos, right? It wasn't in real life.
Right, and so that's part of the power in this. We're really intentional around when we ask schools to build their rounds team at their host site, that the host site is, that team is, you know, really an eclectic team, right? Not just teachers, but instructional coach, principal, someone from district office, and so on. Yeah, but Val, I think it's
specials teachers on ours. We
right,
had
right,
the
everybody.
and the music teacher.
It's open to everybody. So I love that idea, Val. I'd love to. It's my passion with rounds. It was when I was a building principal. And so to be able to help lead this work at this level has been really rewarding for us and for me. And so I think once we get rebooting, I think more to come with that idea. I'm so glad you lifted it, because we don't want to lose sight of that, certainly.
Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. What other questions for us? Logistical questions? All right. Well, we want to give you this gift of time, right? We weren't certain if we would need the full hour and a half. It appears we do not. So thank you for your time. You should have that interest survey, to complete. You have some time to do that. Try to capture as best as you can on there. If you're finding, Audrey, when you get in that interest form, if there's not a space to capture what you shared, send me an email and we'll modify the form to give you a space to do it so that you can put it in there. Okay. And then invite folks tomorrow. If you have other, people, teacher leaders or coaches that might have a little bit of time tomorrow to jump on, they can certainly do that, but we'll also send out the recording to you as well. All right. Well, we look forward to working with you soon. Yay. Have a great rest of your school year if we don't see you before then.